Before we dive in, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. You don't want to miss the shocking true story of the Aryan Brotherhood. Every week we uncover the hidden world of crime, betrayal and power that most people will never see. Stay with us until the end, because what you're about to hear will change the way you see the streets, the prisons, and the forces that control them. Comment below your thoughts and join the community that uncovers the truth behind America's most dangerous gangs. The year was 1964. San Quentin prison stood like a concrete beast on the edge of the California coastline, its walls thick with the scent of iron, sweat, and death. Inside, the air vibrated with tension. The civil rights movement was changing America outside, but behind these bars, change came only through blood. Racial lines were carved deeper than the cracks in the prison floor. The black guerrilla family ruled one wing, the Mexican mafia another, and the whites, the outnumbered and divided, had nothing but fear to cling to. Among them was a man named John Red Slater, a lanky ex-biker from Arizona. His forearms were covered in fading tattoos, ghosts from a life that had already lost its color. He'd been locked up for manslaughter, a bar fight gone wrong. But in San Quentin, murder wasn't a crime. It was currency. On his first week, he watched as a white inmate was stabbed 23 times in the shower by a group from the black guerrilla family. The guards didn't move, they just watched. The message was clear: no one would save you here. That night, Red sat on the edge of his bunk, shaking, staring at the blood still crusted on his boots. Across the cell block, another white inmate named Barry Mills, a quiet man with pale eyes that never blinked long enough to show emotion, was doing the same. Mills wasn't new to prison life. He'd learned early that fear is contagious, and in places like this, it spreads faster than disease. But he also knew something else. Fear could be turned into power. It began with whispers, small conversations between cells, scraps of paper passed under doors, coded words in the yard. They talked about protection, about unity, about not dying alone. Within weeks, a circle had formed, small, secret, but growing. They called themselves the Family at first. Later, it would take a new name, one that would echo through every prison in America: the Aryan Brotherhood. The first blood oath happened in the laundry room, hidden from the guards by piles of dirty sheets. Red cut his palm with a razor. Then Barry did the same. Their blood mixed as they pressed their hands together. "We stand for our own," Barry said, his voice calm but cold. "No one outside this circle matters." Around them stood 6 others, their eyes burning with the same mix of fear and fury. That night, the Brotherhood was born. Violence became their language. It started small, a knife hidden in a book, a message scratched on the wall, but it grew quickly. A member of the Mexican mafia tried to tax one of the white inmates for cigarettes. The next morning, he was found in the yard with his throat cut open, the letters AB carved into his chest with a sharpened spoon. From that day on, no one taxed the whites again. The Brotherhood had made its point. Red became their enforcer. Barry became their strategist. They were opposites in every way, one impulsive and wild, the other methodical and ruthless. But together, they built something terrifying. Their symbol was a shamrock, 3 leaves for loyalty, honor, and blood. To join, you had to kill for the cause. "Blood in, blood out," Barry said, the rule that would define them forever. By the end of the year, the Aryan Brotherhood controlled the white population in San Quentin. They ran contraband, controlled the gambling, and punished anyone who defied them. Guards looked the other way, sometimes out of fear, sometimes for a cut of the profit. It wasn't just a gang anymore, it was a machine, efficient, brutal, unstoppable. But power always demands sacrifice. One night, a young recruit named Tommy refused an order. He'd been told to stab a black inmate who had insulted a Brotherhood member. Tommy hesitated. He said he didn't want to kill anyone. The next morning, his body was found hanging from a bedsheet, his own belt wrapped around his neck. The note pinned to his chest read, "Blood out." The violence drew attention. The warden called it racial unrest, but the FBI later called it something else, the birth of a prison empire. The Aryan Brotherhood had turned San Quentin into their training ground, and soon other prisons followed. Folsom, Pelican Bay, Alcatraz before it closed. Everywhere they went, chaos followed like a shadow. Barry Mills wrote letters that found their way beyond the walls, recruiting white inmates from across California's system. Some joined for protection, others for purpose. Most joined because they were afraid not to. And so, from fear, the Brotherhood grew, a paradox wrapped in blood. Years later, a retired guard would describe it best. They didn't just kill people, they made death a religion. The turning point came in 1971, when a riot erupted in the yard after a black inmate attacked a Brotherhood member. What started as a fistfight ended as a massacre. Shanks flashed in the sunlight, guards fired warning shots that no one heard, and by the time it was over, 6 men were dead. 3 black, 2 Hispanic, 1 white. The prison went into lockdown for months, but it didn't matter. The message was out. The Aryan Brotherhood was no longer a rumor whispered in cell blocks. It was a force. It had rules, leaders, soldiers, and above all, a mission to dominate every inch of concrete they walked on. Inside those walls, they were gods, and gods demanded worship through fear. And as Red sat in his cell that night, listening to the silence after the riot, he smiled for the first time since entering San Quentin. "We're not just surviving anymore," he said quietly to himself. "We're building an empire." Outside, the ocean crashed against the rocks, indifferent to the violence that had just rewritten prison history. But inside, in the heart of the storm, the Brotherhood's first empire had begun, and the world had no idea what was coming next. By 1972, San Quentin had become more than a prison. It was a war zone divided by skin color and loyalty. Every race had its own army, its own code, its own kingdom carved into the concrete. And now at the center of it all stood the Aryan Brotherhood. What began as a desperate pact for survival had evolved into something much darker, far more organized. They weren't fighting to stay alive anymore. They were fighting to rule. Red Slater had become the face of that rule, the Brotherhood's blade. He was the kind of man who smiled during a fight, the kind who would rather die standing than live on his knees. By now, every inmate knew that if Red was walking toward you, it was already too late. Beside him was Barry Mills, the mind that made the machine move. From his small, dimly lit cell, Barry directed violence like a general mapping a battlefield. He had an old chessboard carved into his metal table, each pawn representing a life inside those walls. San Quentin's administration called it racial management. Inmates called it the war. The Brotherhood didn't just defend themselves anymore. They launched attacks. Their enemies were many: the Mexican Mafia, the Black Guerrilla family, the Nuestra Familia. These were groups built on pride and power, and the Brotherhood wanted both. Their first target was control of the drug flow inside the prison. Whoever controlled the dope controlled the debt, and whoever controlled the debt controlled everyone. The first strike came during meal hour. A member of the Mexican Mafia, Rafael Ortega, was sitting at the far end of the cafeteria, laughing with his crew. He never saw Red coming. The knife, a piece of sharpened steel hidden inside a Bible, slid between Ortega's ribs with surgical precision. He fell face first into his tray, his blood spreading across the table like spilled wine. No one screamed, no one moved. Even the guards froze. Red wiped the blade on his sleeve and walked away. That single act wasn't about revenge. It was about dominance. That killing set off a chain reaction that would transform the entire California prison system. Retaliations came fast. Ambushes in the showers, poison slipped into food, bodies found in laundry bags. Every death carried a message, carved in skin or inked in blood. AB runs this yard. The Brotherhood began taking over gambling rings, smuggling networks, and even guard payoffs. They built a shadow government inside the prison, one the administration couldn't touch, one that thrived in the cracks of fear. Barry Mills wrote letters to other prisons, sending orders wrapped in code. The words seemed harmless, phrases about weather, chess, or family, but each one carried instructions for murder. Outside on the streets, released members picked up where the letters left off. The Brotherhood's power spread beyond the walls, crossing into Los Angeles, Las Vegas, and even Chicago. Their empire of violence was no longer confined to bars and cells. It was leaking into America itself. Inside San Quentin, things grew worse. Guards tried to separate the gangs, but it didn't matter. The Brotherhood's reach stretched through segregation units, through solitary confinement, through every whisper that passed from cell to cell. They had become something the system couldn't contain, something it had accidentally created. Fear had turned into faith. Every white inmate, whether he wanted it or not, was under their protection and under their control. Then came the Yard incident. It was a hot July afternoon when tensions finally snapped. Rumors had spread that the Black Guerrilla family planned to ambush a Brotherhood member during recreation time. Instead, the Brotherhood struck first. Hidden shanks, razor blades melted into toothbrushes, even homemade grenades filled with nails. Everything was prepared. When the gates opened, chaos exploded. Screams echoed across the concrete. Guards fired warning shots that went ignored. Men fought like animals, blinded by rage and adrenaline. In the middle of it, Red Slater moved like a ghost. He tackled a rival, stabbing him over and over, blood spraying his face. Around him, the yard became a field of death, bodies writhing, dust rising, sirens screaming. The fight lasted only minutes, but when it ended, 8 inmates were dead, dozens wounded, and the Brotherhood had sent a message that would burn itself into prison history. Don't test us. The riot was covered up by officials who feared public outrage, but inside the system, the legend grew. The Aryan Brotherhood had turned fear into a weapon, and that weapon was now unstoppable. Their motto spread like wildfire among the white population: honor, loyalty, blood. Some joined willingly, others joined because they knew the alternative was a slow, painful death. Barry Mills, now locked in solitary, was more powerful than ever. He didn't need to speak loudly. A single piece of paper could decide life or death for anyone in the prison system. The FBI began calling him the Baron. To the Brotherhood, he was a prophet. His letters became scripture. His orders became gospel. Meanwhile, Red had grown colder. Killing no longer made him feel anything. It was just part of the job. One night, sitting in his cell, he confessed to another member that he couldn't even remember how many men he'd killed. The other inmate laughed and said, "That's how you know you belong, brother." Red didn't laugh back. Deep down, he knew something was changing inside him. The violence that had once given him power was now consuming him from within. By the late 1970s, the Brotherhood had achieved what no other gang had ever done: total dominance inside multiple prisons across California. Even the Mexican mafia, once untouchable, began negotiating with them. The Brotherhood demanded taxes from other gangs, enforced by contract killings. They called it rent. Everyone paid, or everyone bled, and yet, for all their power, Barry Mills knew one truth that kept him awake at night. Power in prison meant nothing if it couldn't survive outside. Behind those bars, he began drafting the next phase of their conquest, a silent expansion into the free world. Drugs, money, connections, soldiers on the streets. The Brotherhood was preparing to leave the cage. As Red looked through the small window of his cell, he realized they had done it. They had turned fear into currency, death into loyalty, and blood into brotherhood. But he also knew that once a war begins, it never truly ends. Somewhere deep in his gut, he felt it. The storm was just beginning. The Aryan Brotherhood had won control of the prisons. Now, it was ready to claim America itself. By the dawn of the 1980s, the walls of San Quentin could no longer contain the force that the Aryan Brotherhood had become. Their symbols, the shamrock, the lightning bolts, the silent threat of a man's stare, had spread like a plague through America's prison system. What had started as a desperate brotherhood for survival was now an empire, and empires by their nature do not stay confined. The men who were paroled or released carried more than tattoos on their skin. They carried a mission. One of them was Jake Holloway, known inside as Ghost. He had spent 15 years in and out of solitary, a man sharpened by darkness. When he walked out of prison, he didn't look back. He didn't need to. The Brotherhood walked with him. On the outside, California was burning with opportunity. The drug trade was exploding. Meth labs in the desert, cocaine flooding from the south, heroin in the veins of every forgotten city. And in the middle of it all, Ghost saw something familiar. Chaos, waiting to be controlled. The first outpost of the Brotherhood's empire wasn't built in a city or a mansion. It was a rundown bar on the outskirts of Bakersfield. Ghost turned it into a meeting place, a command post, and a recruitment hub for ex-cons who'd taken the oath behind bars. The Brotherhood outside didn't wear prison uniforms anymore. They wore leather jackets, rode motorcycles, and carried the same code in their hearts. Blood in, blood out. Within months, Ghost had built a network stretching through biker gangs, neo-Nazi groups, and meth cooks who owed him more than money. But Ghost wasn't just running drugs, he was building infrastructure. He knew that violence earned respect, but structure earned control. The Brotherhood became the silent hand, guiding a dozen smaller gangs, financing their deals, providing protection, and eliminating their rivals. Each operation funneled money back into the prison system, where Barry Mills and Red Slater still ruled from their cells. Through coded letters, they directed operations with military precision. The paper trail was invisible, but the trail of bodies was not. In Los Angeles, a man named Tony Blue Eyes Kramer tried to start his own independent crew, refusing to pay the Brotherhood's tax. It was a mistake that cost him more than his life. One night, as he left a strip club in East LA, a van pulled up beside him. Two masked men stepped out. The sound of a shotgun echoed through the alley. The next morning, police found his body nailed to the wall of his own garage, a shamrock carved into his chest. On the floor, written in his blood, were two words, "Rent paid." That murder sent shockwaves through the underworld. The message was clear. The Aryan Brotherhood had left the prison, and it had no intention of sharing power. Inside the system, Barry Mills received the report like a general hearing of a successful campaign. He smiled, folded the letter, and passed it to another inmate with orders to burn it. For him, every act of violence outside was proof of his control inside. Power had transcended the bars. As the years passed, the Brotherhood's operations expanded into every major American city. Meth production boomed in the Midwest, with Brotherhood-affiliated bikers guarding laboratories like military outposts. In Nevada, they infiltrated the casino scene, laundering dirty money through gambling operations. In Texas, they built alliances with local gangs for weapons distribution. Even in New York, where racial lines in organized crime were rigid and centuries old, whispers of the AB began to circulate among the mob. But every empire grows on blood, and every expansion demands sacrifice. Ghost's men were ruthless, but they were not invincible. In 1985, a DEA task force raided one of their drug houses near Fresno. Inside, they found cash, chemicals, and the body of a rival gang leader chained to a chair. His teeth were scattered on the floor like dice. That image made headlines, and suddenly the Brotherhood's name was no longer a rumor, it was national news. For Barry Mills, this was both a triumph and a threat. Fame brought fear, but fear also brought attention. The FBI began to connect the dots. Murders in Los Angeles, drug routes in Nevada, money laundering in Kansas, all tracing back to one invisible hand, the Aryan Brotherhood. Their investigation called it a prison-born syndicate. They weren't wrong. Meanwhile, inside the walls, Red Slater grew restless. Years in solitary confinement had turned him into a legend, but legends fade when they stop moving. He wanted to feel the outside air again, to walk among the empire he had helped create. He started writing letters to Ghost, urging him to push further, to make the Brotherhood untouchable. "Fear them before they find you," he wrote. "Control isn't given, it's taken." Ghost took the words as law. By the end of the decade, the Brotherhood's influence reached every corner of the criminal underworld. They supplied drugs to Black and Hispanic gangs they once swore to destroy. They traded weapons with outlaw bikers and protection with the Italian mafia. Ideology had given way to profit, but their core belief remained. The Brotherhood came first. Loyalty was currency. Betrayal was death. In 1988, Ghost orchestrated what would become the Brotherhood's most infamous operation, a prison breakout in Arizona designed to free a high-ranking member named Luke "Hammer" Daniels. The plan was pure madness, but it worked. Disguised as construction workers, a team of Brotherhood soldiers cut through a perimeter fence and rammed a truck through the outer gate. In less than 6 minutes, Hammer was gone. The prison went into lockdown. Helicopters filled the sky, but it didn't matter. Hammer was already in Mexico, protected by cartel allies who owed the Brotherhood a fortune. That single act proved what no one had dared to believe. The Aryan Brotherhood could reach anywhere. Outside, Ghost stood on a motel balcony, looking out at the desert. He lit a cigarette and watched the sunrise burn the horizon. In his pocket, a small folded letter from Barry Mills read, "The Empire stands." He smiled. They had done the impossible. The Brotherhood had built a network that spanned prisons, states, and borders, a criminal kingdom bound by blood and ruled by fear. But as the empire grew, so did the paranoia. Rivals plotted revenge, allies whispered betrayal, and even among the Brotherhood, trust began to rot. For every victory they claimed, there was a shadow waiting to strike back. And deep within the cells of Marion Penitentiary, Barry Mills knew what history had always taught him. Empires don't die from outside attacks. They die from within. The Brotherhood had conquered the streets. The next war would be to keep them. By the late 1980s, the Aryan Brotherhood was no longer just a prison gang. It was a criminal empire, operating like a shadow government within America's correctional system. But inside those steel walls, even power had limits. The Brotherhood had grown too strong to ignore and too dangerous to contain, yet they faced a silent crisis. Expansion required resources they didn't have. They could control the prisons, yes, but to rule the streets, they needed something bigger, something unholy. That's when the unthinkable happened. The so-called soldiers of white purity began making deals with their sworn enemies. It started small. A few shipments of methamphetamine moving through contacts in the Mexican mafia. A little heroin traded with the cartels of Sinaloa and Juarez. At first, it was purely transactional, pragmatism wrapped in hatred. The Brotherhood despised the idea of working with non-whites, but money has a way of silencing ideology. Barry Mills, now one of the most feared men in the prison system, once said from his isolation cell, "We don't shake hands with them, we use them." And that became the guiding rule. The Brotherhood's leaders operated from behind bars, but their influence spread far beyond the walls. Through coded messages and corrupt lawyers, they orchestrated deals that blurred the lines between race and power. A smuggled note could order a killing in another state. A single word whispered during visitation could trigger $1 million drug transaction. To the FBI, it looked like chaos. To the Brotherhood, it was evolution. They began to call it the silent infiltration. Unlike the bloody wars of the past, this new phase didn't rely on open conflict. It thrived on shadows, on cooperation that could never be acknowledged. The Brotherhood's lieutenants formed pacts with Mexican cartel operatives, the Hells Angels, and outlaw biker clubs that dominated the highways of the American West. It was an ecosystem of crime, each group filling the other's gaps. The bikers controlled distribution, the cartels controlled supply, and the Brotherhood controlled the flow from inside the system. It was said that from their cells, Brotherhood leaders could influence the drug market in Los Angeles, Denver, and even parts of the East Coast. They didn't just profit, they managed chaos. By keeping rival groups at war, they ensured that everyone eventually needed their protection. The irony was as dark as it was undeniable. The Brotherhood, born in racial hatred, had become dependent on the very people they once swore to destroy. For every alliance, though, there was a cost. Trust was a language none of these men spoke. Every deal carried an expiration date, and every handshake was a temporary truce in a world where loyalty was bought with fear. When a biker gang once refused to deliver payment for a heroin shipment, the Brotherhood's retaliation was swift and clinical. The gang leader's body was found hanging from a bridge in Arizona with a swastika carved into his chest. No one claimed responsibility, but everyone understood the message. Betrayal would always be answered with silence and steel. The FBI, watching from the outside, couldn't believe what they were seeing. Their investigations revealed an underground economy that connected the most unlikely partners. Agents described it as an invisible empire, a network of killers, smugglers, and white-collar facilitators who operated with military precision. The Brotherhood's members were trained to communicate like spies, using invisible ink, encrypted phone lines, and coded language that even federal linguists struggled to decode. They called their communication chain the Wire of Ghosts. Nothing written, nothing recorded. Messages were passed through wives, girlfriends, and even clergy who didn't know they were being used. In one famous case, a Bible sent from a prison chaplain to a member on the outside contained a hidden instruction page glued between psalms. The message was simple: deliver the package, kill the loose end. The package was a shipment of fentanyl. The loose end was a courier who had started talking to the DEA. Behind every business deal, behind every ounce of profit, there was violence. Violence that no one saw coming. They killed not out of rage, but out of policy. Each act of murder was a calculated decision, part of a system that ran smoother than most corporations. Even among allies, they ruled by fear. The Mexican cartels respected them, but they never forgot what the Brotherhood was capable of. Rumor spread that in one secret meeting inside a federal facility, a Brotherhood shot caller slit the throat of a cartel representative during negotiations, then calmly asked for another delegate to continue the discussion. The deal went through anyway. By the mid-1990s, the silent infiltration had done more than expand the Brotherhood's empire. It had transformed it. What once was a white supremacist gang had now become a multinational criminal network. Money had erased ideology, and control had replaced hate as their true religion. They no longer shouted about racial purity, they whispered about percentages, shipments, and connections. Still, deep down, the old hatred never fully died. It lingered, waiting, whispering through their tattoos and prison walls. For the younger recruits, raised in chaos and indoctrinated in hate, the alliances with non-whites were seen as a betrayal of their creed. Factions began to form, some pushing for expansion at any cost, others demanding a return to the old ways. The leadership tried to balance ideology with pragmatism, but the tension was growing. And that was the danger of the silent infiltration. The Brotherhood was becoming too powerful, too connected, and too divided. Their enemies no longer came only from outside, but from within. The FBI saw the cracks forming and prepared to strike. But even as the walls closed in, the Brotherhood adapted, just as they always had. Their enemies didn't know it yet, but the silent infiltration wasn't just about alliances. It was about learning the enemy's game and taking it from them. Every cartel partnership, every deal with a biker club was another step towards something bigger. Domination without boundaries. Because the Aryan Brotherhood didn't just want power inside prisons anymore. They wanted the streets, the highways, the money, and the fear. And they were willing to work with anyone, or kill anyone, to get it. By the late 1990s, the Aryan Brotherhood had already done the impossible. It had transcended the prison walls. What began as a blood pact behind bars had evolved into a full-blown criminal syndicate that controlled drug routes, executed assassinations, and brokered alliances across racial and state lines. But the world outside was changing fast. Street gangs were multiplying, the drug market was shifting, and technology was rewriting the rules of crime. For the Brotherhood to survive, no, to reign, they needed to take the fight beyond the prisons. The streets of America were about to become their new battlefield. It began in California, where old loyalties were breaking and new money was rising. Methamphetamine had become the new gold, and whoever controlled its production and distribution controlled the underground economy. The Aryan Brotherhood saw opportunity, chaos ripe for conquest. They already had allies among the biker gangs who cooked and moved meth across state borders. Now they needed soldiers. From prison, they began recruiting not just white inmates, but men already out on parole, men with nothing left to lose. These recruits were the Brotherhood's new army. They were tattooed ghosts of the system, addicts, ex-cons, and drifters bound by a single code: blood in, blood out. They operated from rundown motels, garages, and trailer parks across the Midwest and the South. Each chapter was small but lethal. Their orders came from coded letters smuggled out of maximum security cells, written in invisible ink or disguised as religious messages. When local gangs resisted their expansion, the Brotherhood's response was swift and surgical. Drive-bys, kidnappings, and silent disappearances became routine. A Crip-affiliated gang in Oklahoma City was wiped out in less than a month after one of its members insulted a Brotherhood lieutenant. A Mexican mafia runner was found, hanging from a bridge in Nevada with the letters AB carved into his chest, a warning that territory had changed hands. The war for the streets wasn't fought with ideology anymore. It was fought with logistics, fear, and precision. The Brotherhood began operating like a corporation. They established regional representatives, men who oversaw entire states. Each region reported to a higher council, still led by men in prison who used lawyers, girlfriends, and encrypted calls to give orders. Inmates who were supposed to be serving life sentences for murder were, in truth, CEOs of an empire stretching coast to coast. They even began infiltrating legitimate businesses, trucking companies, construction firms, scrapyards, all fronts for laundering money. Cash from meth and heroin sales was funneled through fake invoices and shell corporations. By the time law enforcement traced a dollar, it had already vanished into clean bank accounts or offshore holdings. It was organized crime at its coldest and most intelligent. But as the Brotherhood expanded, they crossed a dangerous line. The FBI, DEA, and ATF had been watching. What they saw wasn't a gang anymore, it was a paramilitary force. When the agencies began compiling data, they discovered that the Aryan Brotherhood was connected to over 200 murders nationwide, most of them orchestrated from behind bars. The FBI called it the Invisible War because to the public it didn't exist. To those who lived it, it was an everyday nightmare. One of the deadliest confrontations happened in 2002 when federal prosecutors tried to dismantle the Brotherhood once and for all. Operation Shot Caller was launched, a nationwide crackdown that targeted over 40 members, including the top leaders Barry Mills and Tyler the Hulk Bingham. The government charged them with multiple counts of murder, conspiracy, and racketeering under the RICO Act. It was supposed to be the death blow to the empire, but the Brotherhood had prepared for this. Even with their leaders isolated in federal supermax prisons, communication never stopped. Using lawyers, coded mail, and corrupt guards, they continued to send orders. When one of their enforcers was captured and offered a deal in exchange for testimony, he was found dead in his cell 2 days later, strangled with a bedsheet. The message was clear. The Brotherhood was still alive, still untouchable. Their retaliation spilled onto the streets. Former members turned assassins, executed federal witnesses, burned safe houses, and targeted anyone suspected of cooperating. Entire small towns in Texas and Oklahoma became war zones, silent ones, hidden from the evening news, but dripping with blood. The Brotherhood didn't fight for money anymore. They fought for survival, for legacy, for the illusion of control. Yet something deeper was changing. The new generation of Brotherhood soldiers wasn't fighting the same ideological war their predecessors had. They didn't talk about racial purity or white dominance. They talked about power and profit. The creed that once united them was dissolving, replaced by greed and paranoia. The older members saw it coming but couldn't stop it. The empire they had built on loyalty was now crumbling from within. By the late 2000s, law enforcement pressure intensified. Undercover agents infiltrated Brotherhood networks, posing as smugglers and buyers. Wiretaps revealed how orders were still being issued from inside maximum security facilities, sometimes using messages hidden in legal paperwork or even tattoos. But for every operation shut down, 2 more emerged somewhere else. It was a hydra of crime. Cut off one head, and another rose in its place. The war for the streets became something larger than drugs or money. It became a reflection of America's own descent into chaos. The Brotherhood thrived wherever the system failed. In small towns ravaged by addiction, in prisons overflowing with despair, in communities where poverty turned young men into soldiers. Every broken life became another recruit, every overdose another prophet. They didn't need ideology anymore. They had the perfect weapon: hopelessness. And as the new millennium unfolded, the Aryan Brotherhood no longer looked like a gang at all. It was a machine, invisible, unrelenting, and built on the bones of the forgotten. America's prisons were its heart, but its veins ran through every city, every street, every deal made in the dark. The war had never really ended. It had simply changed form. And as the FBI would soon learn, the Brotherhood's most terrifying chapter was yet to come. One that wouldn't be fought with guns, but with silence, infiltration, and control. By the 2010s, the Aryan Brotherhood had evolved into something beyond comprehension. A ghost organization hidden in plain sight. Gone were the loud wars of blood and fire. Gone were the open displays of brutality that once marked their rise. What remained was colder, smarter, and infinitely more dangerous. The Brotherhood had learned the final lesson of power. True control doesn't come from visibility. It comes from invisibility. Inside the walls of federal supermax prisons, their leaders sat in cages designed to isolate the most violent men alive. The cells were small, silent, and supposedly impenetrable. Barry Mills, Tyler Bingham, and a handful of top generals were buried deep in concrete tombs where light barely touched the floor. And yet, the empire moved. Orders still flowed, shipments still arrived, and bodies still fell. The FBI called it ghost management. The Brotherhood called it business as usual. The system that had once sought to contain them had, ironically, become their infrastructure. Lawyers carried coded letters disguised as case updates. Corrupt guards smuggled burner phones into cells. Clergy and volunteers unknowingly transported messages written in invisible ink or hidden within prayer books. It was an intricate spiderweb, a bureaucracy of crime that used the state's own mechanisms to operate. Every surveillance measure seemed to only teach them how to hide better. Their operations now reached beyond drugs and murder. They had moved into identity theft, cryptocurrency fraud, real estate scams, and even private security. The old guard had realized something profound. Guns and violence could only take them so far, but money, real, clean money, could buy anything, including silence. Through shell companies and offshore accounts, the Brotherhood began infiltrating legitimate institutions. Some businesses didn't even know who really owned them. To law enforcement, it looked like a ghost economy. Every transaction was legitimate on paper, but behind the scenes, it was tied to the Brotherhood's inner circle. Former inmates became businessmen. Tattoos were covered up, names were changed, records were wiped. They bought land, opened logistics firms, and even made donations to local charities, all part of a strategy to rebrand evil as enterprise. The most disturbing part was how ordinary it all looked. No longer were they the snarling, swastika-covered monsters that headlines once displayed. They were men in suits, men with clean hands, but blood on their history. They had traded the chaos of prison riots for the cold order of financial domination. It was control without confrontation, a silent empire stretching across the country, invisible to the naked eye. And still, inside the walls, the old rituals remained. Recruits were initiated in secret, bound by blood and silence. Even as the organization evolved, its code stayed the same: loyalty, obedience, and violence when required. Blood in, blood out wasn't just a phrase, it was the law of survival. To betray the Brotherhood was to erase yourself from existence. Those who tried to leave were hunted down quietly, their deaths made to look like suicides, overdoses, or accidents. The FBI's frustration reached a breaking point. Decades of investigations had resulted in hundreds of arrests, yet the Brotherhood persisted, evolving faster than law enforcement could adapt. When agents began tracing new financial operations linked to Brotherhood members, they discovered ties to construction contracts, trucking routes, and even private prisons. The idea was unthinkable, that the very institutions meant to contain them had become part of their economic network. A former federal investigator once said in an interview, "They learned to govern themselves better than we ever governed them." It wasn't exaggeration. The Brotherhood operated like a nation without borders, a shadow government fueled by discipline, violence, and an unshakable belief in control. They had no elections, no politics, no ideology left, only hierarchy and power. Perhaps the most haunting evolution came from their silence. The younger members, those who grew up watching their predecessors die or disappear, understood the new rules. No boasting, no noise, no attention. Violence was no longer a message. It was a signature, delivered cleanly and without witnesses. The Brotherhood had become the perfect predator, one that didn't roar, didn't strike in daylight, and didn't need to prove anything anymore. Every prison in America had its whispers. Guards would say that when a new recruit was chosen, his initiation began not with violence, but with a story. The story of the Brotherhood's rise. From a handful of men cornered in San Quentin to a nationwide empire of terror and wealth, the lesson was always the same. The system tried to bury us. We learned to grow in the dark, and so they did. Even after Barry Mills died in 2018, the machine didn't falter. Leadership passed silently, unseen. The hierarchy was so decentralized that killing one head only made the others stronger. Their structure had become fluid, adaptable, resilient, self-healing. By the early 2020s, reports began surfacing of Brotherhood involvement in political rallies, extremist funding, and militia coordination. But unlike before, they weren't waving flags or shouting slogans. They were the men behind the scenes, the ones financing the anger, steering the chaos, and profiting from division. They had become what every government fears most, a power that exists everywhere, but answers to no one. The Brotherhood's shadow now stretches across 2 generations. What began as a prison gang is now a transnational, multi-industry organism. And yet, ask anyone inside a cell what it really means to be part of it, and they'll tell you the truth. it still feels like war. The blood oaths, the brotherhood, the paranoia, and the ghosts of those who didn't survive. The violence might be quieter now, but it hasn't disappeared. It's just learned how to wear a suit. In the end, the Aryan Brotherhood achieved something terrifying. They became untouchable by becoming invisible. They didn't just conquer prisons, they conquered the system that built them. Their flag isn't a symbol anymore. It's a shadow cast over every cell block, every street, every deal made in the dark. And in that silence, the legend lives on. Because when power hides in the dark long enough, it stops being a crime. It becomes history.